Hi, I'm Ross Tayler. Welcome to Sacred Sundays, a space to slow down, tune in, and return to what's sacred within and around you. Some weeks you'll hear a sound-based offering to open the space. Other times we'll simply begin in conversation. However it unfolds, this is an invitation into presence, connection, and the beauty of the unseen. So pour a cup of tea, settle in, and let's begin. Today I'm happy to welcome Maïa Mercure to Sacred Sundays. Maïa is a registered death doula, shamanic reiki master, and plant medicine guide. She brings a deep well of lived and professional experience to her work, rooted in a lifelong relationship with grief and healing. Maïa's path began early in life when her father died suddenly at the age of 6. This formative loss instilled in her a profound awareness of mortality and the human need for compassionate support through life's transitions. After moving through her own grief journey, she felt called to walk alongside others in theirs. Over the past few years, Maïa has invested in extensive training and dedicated over 200 hours of community service to her local hospice organization, sitting bedside with patients as they've taken their last breaths, offering Reiki to palliative clients and grieving families, and facilitating advanced care planning sessions and community death cafes. With a background in spiritual care, her approach is rooted in helping individuals and families find meaning, peace, and connection in times of transition. She serves her clients with deep presence, compassion, and integrity, and is committed to restoring death care as a natural and sacred part of community life. Welcome, Maïa.
Thanks, Ross. Happy to be here.
So good to have you. I've had the pleasure of attending 2 of your recent public offerings, which you refer to as death cafes, and they've been a really powerful experience, and I'd just love to continue the conversation here with you today.
Absolutely.
So Maïa is actually going to begin by sharing a reading with us. So I'll hand it over to Maïa.
Okay. Awesome. So, yeah, just wanted to provide a little bit of context on this before I launch into it. So, this is just a piece of writing that I found online and came across and was really struck by because it was probably the most accurate description I've come across about grief and what that feels like and how it changes over time. So that's what I wanted to read for my offering today. So it was written about 15 years ago online, and um, it was written anonymously. So all I know about the person that posted it is that he's an older guy, and I believe he's from Chicago because he references the O'Hare Airport in this piece of writing. So it was posted in response to someone asking, "My friend just died, and I don't know what to do." And this is what the man offered. He says, "All right, here goes. I'm old. What that means is that I've survived so far, and a lot of people I've known and loved did not. I've lost friends, best friends, acquaintances, coworkers, grandparents, mom, relatives, teachers, mentors, students, neighbors, and a host of other folks. I have no children, and I can't imagine the pain it must be to lose a child, but here's my 2 cents. I wish I could say you get used to people dying. I never did. I don't want to. It tears a hole through me whenever someone I love dies, no matter the circumstances. But I don't want it to not matter. I don't want it to be something that just passes. My scars are a testament to the love and the relationship that I had for and with that person. And if the scar is deep, so is the love. So be it. Scars are a testament to life. Scars are a testament that I can love deeply and live deeply and be cut or even gouged, and that I can heal and continue to live and continue to love. And the scar tissue is stronger than the original flesh ever was. Scars are a testament to life. Scars are only ugly to people who can't see. As for grief, you'll find it comes in waves. When the ship is first wrecked, you're drowning, with wreckage all around you. Everything floating around you reminds you of the beauty and the magnificence of the ship that was and is no more. And all you can do is float. You find some piece of the wreckage and you hang on for a while. Maybe it's some physical thing. Maybe it's a happy memory or a photograph. Maybe it's a person who is also floating. For a while, all you can do is float, stay alive. In the beginning, the waves are 100 feet tall and crash over you without mercy. They come 10 seconds apart and don't even give you time to catch your breath. All you can do is hang on and float. After a while, maybe weeks, maybe months, you'll find the waves are still 100 feet tall, but they come further apart. When they come, they still crash over you and wipe you out. But in between, you can breathe and you can function. You never know what's going to trigger the grief. It might be a song, a picture, a street intersection, the smell of a cup of coffee. It can be just about anything, and the waves come crashing. But in between waves, there is life. Somewhere down the line, and it's different for everybody, you find that the waves are only 80 feet tall or 50 feet tall. And while they still come, they come further apart. You can see them coming: an anniversary, a birthday, or Christmas, or landing at O'Hare. You can see it coming for the most part and prepare yourself. And when it washes over you, you know that somehow you will again come out the other side, soaking wet, sputtering, still hanging on to some tiny piece of wreckage, but you'll come out. And then he goes on to say, take it from an old guy. The waves never stop coming, and somehow you don't really want them to. But you learn that you'll survive them, and other waves will come, and you'll survive them too. If you're lucky, you'll have lots of scars from lots of loves and lots of shipwrecks.
Wow. That is super powerful and relatable for sure. It's interesting because as I heard it, I actually had a wave of emotion come up because there's something about, I think before we started, you and I were talking about grief in general, and I think it just reminded me of so much of the grief that I've had to go through. I've had to do it alone, and we had talked a little bit about community coming together in different cultures when grief happens. And so maybe that's the part that kind of stuck with me. But as you read that, it just made me remember the things that I've gone through, which is one of the great things about talking about this topic.
Mhm.
So where would you like to start? Because we're talking about grief and because it's something that you've immersed yourself in, where's a good place to start for you?
I'd be happy to talk about my own grief journey just because there's a lot of contrast in that experience, and it might be relatable, or parts of it might be relatable to different people. And yeah, it kind of shows two contrasting experiences of types of loss and types of grief that can go along with them. And yeah, kind of my journey along the way. So I could start there if you'd like.
That sounds great.
So, as you were reading in the bio, I had lost my dad in a traumatic way when I was 6 years old. So, that is why I say that I've kind of had a lifelong initiation into death work and working through grief, because he died in 1999. So, it's something I've been working through for, I guess, 25 years now. And I've come to a place with that grief where even though he died traumatically, I have a relationship with his spirit, and the grief doesn't feel crushing to me anymore. So, like in that piece of writing that I just read, I really liked how he talks about how the waves start, and at first they're 100 feet tall, and you get buried in them, and you feel like incapacitated, like you can't move because the grief is so intense. And then over time, the waves are 80 feet tall or 50 feet tall. And he talks about kind of like the integration that needs to happen in order to move forward in life. Over the years, I feel like that's what I've had to learn to do with that grief. And because he died when I was a kid, it was a pretty disorienting experience. And a lot of the grief that I had, I didn't understand, or came out in different ways, like in behavioral ways. But as I got older, I was able to kind of be more intentional and work with that grief more intentionally. And then later in my life, I lost my grandmother, who was very close to me when she was 96 years old. And I was able to be with her at her bedside when she died. And it was a really gradual death. So she was in long term care, 96 years old. He received a phone call that she was no longer eating. And I was able to like take the day off work and go sit with her and be with her and just be present. And then she died that day. And yeah, just with how gradual that experience was compared to losing my dad suddenly when I was a kid was completely different. And I grieved completely differently for my grandmother when she died in that way. I wanted to touch on the different types of grief and different types of loss. So, to put it at a high level, there's basically complicated grief and uncomplicated grief. So, a death like my grandmother's, where you kind of have some mourning that the person is going to pass, and you're able to go say goodbye to them and be present, and then they die peacefully and gracefully. Usually, the grief that comes from that is not too difficult for us to integrate, or it's easier to handle than when someone dies suddenly or traumatically or violently. So, for the longest time in my life, I was buried in my grief. And I think it was like my grandma's death 20 years later, after my dad's death, was kind of an enlightening moment because I realized that not all death had to be terrible and scary and painful. In letting her go more gracefully, I was able to then see my dad's death in a different light and start working with that grief more intentionally.
I appreciate you sharing those two contrasting examples because it really does show the differences of what you had to go through. And for me, it makes me remember that both of my parents, when they passed, it was the uncomplicated version of death. And the process wasn't really that challenging because I knew it was coming and I could prepare for it. And there was no sudden pieces to it. And I've also witnessed people go through those sudden deaths and how much harder that is. So I appreciate those two contrasting examples.
Yeah, I can go into more depth too. So, with complicated grief, it can rear its head like when you least expect it. It can happen delayed. There's also like when someone dies traumatically. So, whether that be by suicide or overdose or murder, like things like that, that are really shocking to the system, our grief can come up in different ways and unexpected ways. But on top of that, usually in circumstances like that, we're not only dealing with our grief and the sorrow from the loss of that person, but we're also usually dealing with a lot of other things like stigma, judgment, gossiping, like whispering, pity, like all these other things that come along with traumatic deaths like that. So that's a whole thing in and of itself to deal with as well. So it's not only the grief of the person that we've lost, but working through all of that side of things too. And to be honest, like reflecting back on my experience as a kid, I actually think those other factors were more detrimental to kind of my process of losing my dad than the actual grief itself. Because for me, the grief of losing my dad came later, I would say. It was quite delayed. Like, I
Mm.
have a vivid memory of, I guess this would have been kind of in middle school. I had a friend, so we probably were about maybe 14 or 15 at the time, and a friend of mine lost her dad. And I went to the funeral, and the funeral happened to be at the same place in my hometown where my dad's memorial service had been held. So I don't really remember much about my dad's memorial service because I was 6 at the time. But to go to my friend's dad's memorial service at that same location, like a decade later, was interesting experience. Basically, she started playing a song on guitar, and I just broke down in tears. I was sobbing. I couldn't breathe. I was really intense, and I had to leave and go sit. There was like a back pond in the venue, and I just went and sat by the pond and sobbed. And luckily my mom was with me at the time, and yeah, she was sitting with me, and eventually we had to leave. She's like, "Do you want to get out of here?" And I was like, "Yeah," because it was just such an intense experience. But basically that was kind of my delayed grief coming up of the grief I had never felt at my own dad's memorial service coming up 10 years later at this other memorial service. So yeah, that's an example of delayed grief that can crop up. There's also disenfranchised grief. That's another type of grief. So when somebody dies, this happens a lot with like overdose, I would say. Basically, disenfranchised grief is when the people around you might not feel like your sadness or your sorrow is justified. So they might have a judgment about your person that's died, and then they don't see your grief as valid, which is
Mm.
really tricky too. So yeah, that can happen too with traumatic losses. So it just gets a lot more sticky and complicated when depending on the relationship we had with the person that's passed and the way that they died, that can really influence our grief journey.
Thank you for adding those different layers because It is important to consider. It makes me think of some of the conversations that I had working in treatment centers about grief and the 5 stages of grief. And it's way more than that. There's so much more going on when someone experiences a loss, and everybody is going to have their own experience based on the experience that they're going through. And it's hard to see all of that, which really it makes me think about the role that you're bringing to the community and those that are going through this is to guide them through that and to support them to see the things they might not see and to bring process that might be helpful. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, sometimes people don't even realize they are in grief too. So
Right.
that's something that comes up too. And even for myself too, even just recently, this past summer, I was kind of feeling a little lethargic and I didn't really know what the cause of it was. And then I kind of clued in. It took me a couple months to clue in. I was like, why am I feeling like this? Like it's summertime. I should be out enjoying the sun. And I just like couldn't pull myself out of bed some days. And eventually I realized, oh, I'm in grief.
Mm,
And it wasn't grief from a death loss. It was grief from a connection that felt deep for me and that had ended. And
mm,
so it was grief from that, not a death loss. But even still, even I, as a death doula that works with death and grief all the time, it took me a couple months to clue into the fact that I was actually in grief. And so once I realized that, I was like, oh, yeah, it makes sense why my chest is feeling heavy and all this stuff. And then I started working with that grief and now kind of work through that. But I think, yeah, the biggest thing working with people in community is, first of all, recognizing that we're in grief and then intentionally working with it at our own pace. So the thing about working with grief is that, yeah, we kind of want to titrate the experience in order to integrate it healthily. So if we are just sitting in our grief and are not able to kind of ever come out of that and experience any joy, then it's really hard to work through that sorrow. So, the thing that I think a lot of people don't take into consideration in their grieving process is how essential it is to also still connect with our joy and experience joy. Because sometimes when we're in grief, we feel guilty about that. It's like, oh, we've just lost our person. We don't want to go and like have a great time like out with a friend or something like that. We feel like we almost need to be at home grieving sometimes. And I think what's really helped me work through my grief is that titration experience of holding both the light with the dark. And of course, in the beginning stages of grief, like we are just buried in it, like the metaphor of like the 100-foot wave coming at us. So in the beginning stages, that is what it feels like. But over time, once we start to kind of like rear our heads out of that, like being buried in it, then we can start to slowly experience joy in our lives again. And that's what helps us eventually integrate that sadness into our lives. So it makes me think of the temperance card in the tarot deck. That's usually depicted as an angel holding 2 cups, and the angel's kind of pouring the cups between each other. And that's kind of how I picture integrating our grief and working through our grief is being able to hold both the light and the dark simultaneously. You can't really have grief without joy, and you can't have joy without grief. We develop our capacity to experience joy by having the courage to face our sorrow.
I really appreciate what you said because it highlights something else for me, which is this piece around if we don't confront our relationship to death, are we really living? And I think that's something that came through in the reading that you shared at the beginning. It's like they are both interconnected, and yet it feels like my experience culturally is that my relationship to talking about death has been stunted. I think of being confronted with death was a friend who lost her son, and I had no idea what to do. Like, I think I actually avoided the whole situation because I couldn't step towards it. And that was the best I could do. And it really makes me wonder, when did we start to avoid the topic of death instead of confronting it and it being a very natural part of our everyday existence?
Yeah, that's such a good question because community death care used to be part of our natural cycles and rhythms, and people used to care for their own dead at home. That's where the idea of funeral parlors comes from. It used to be the front room in people's homes where if someone died, they would have a wake in that front room and there'd be children present, and it wasn't a weird thing at all. It was just part of life. The community would gather around and support the grieving family members. So that's how it used to be. And then over time, we kind of started outsourcing the dying process into the medical system and into funeral homes. So that process, we kind of distanced ourselves from community support and that whole process. And I believe that's where our avoidance with death comes from, because back then it was such a natural part of life that we weren't avoidant and it wasn't really taboo. I would say that started probably about 100 years ago when we kind of industrialized the whole process. Instead of dying at home, dying in hospitals with that process. Sometimes family members might be there by the bedside in those final moments, but a lot of times they might not be. And then with the process that happens after that, sometimes we're able to go in and see our loved one that has passed in hospital. Sometimes we're not. They may get whisked away to be embalmed by the funeral home. And then, depending on the funeral structure, it might be open casket or not. There's like a disconnect that happens in losing the loved one. When they used to die at home, we would see them lying in front of us and see their lifeless body, and we could tell, okay, this person is no longer living. And it takes our psyche a little while to process that, but to see that in front of us is a healthier, kind of like our nervous system is able to integrate that. Again, this concept of integration. It's like the pace of that happening. It probably happens over a few days. So, for example, like in home funerals, you might have your person at home and they might die, and you might spend time with them for 3 or 4 days. And over those 3 or 4 days, your brain and your nervous system has a chance to catch up to what's actually happening. Whereas if somebody dies in a clinical setting and you may or may not be at their bedside, or you may or may not be part of the process of preparing their body after death or the memorial service, there's a lot more disconnection. So it's like it interrupts the natural flow and the natural rhythm, and it does something to our psyche where it kind of short circuits and we kind of start to spin out a little bit because we don't really know what's happening to our loved one, and we might not necessarily see them again. So it's kind of like for our psyche, there's no chance for our nervous system to see that, okay, this person is no longer living. Like that part of it doesn't happen. So it's harder for us to integrate that experience because it feels like that person has gone to some elusive place and gone into like this neverland, and it just makes it harder for our brains and our nervous systems and bodies to reconcile that loss when it happens in that way.
We might get stuck in the emotional trauma that comes from the experience, and we're not actually able to move through that in a natural way.
Exactly.
And so the work that you do brings some support and guidance to that process so that it isn't what you just described in the way that it's become.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I notice in the work that I do is that the experience of losing someone is the time in our life where we get confronted with emotions. So it's like if we haven't got a connection with feeling our emotions, it can often surface when we lose someone. And so it increases the intensity of it. And perhaps we're even bringing other emotions that aren't related to that loss. And it feels like it's too much because when I talk with people about emotions, it's a difficult topic to engage with. Like we're very much in a culture that is mentally focused and disconnected from our bodies in a lot of ways. And to be disconnected from our bodies is to be disconnected from our emotional experience as well. And so there's a lot that's happening when we lose someone that we may not have ever experienced.
Mhm. Yeah. And that is a pretty common experience where we might have buried grief or any emotion that's buried really And losing someone can reignite that. Kind of like my example with my friend's dad that passed, and then I experienced my own grief 10 years later by going to that memorial service. It's like sometimes we do bury those emotions so deeply in our body and we try to forget about them. But then it's inevitable that something in our life, whether it's death loss or any other type of big experience, will trigger that again. So
Uh-huh.
we're doing ourselves a disservice by suppressing those emotions instead of letting them flow through and actually experiencing them and having the courage to feel them, because they're going to pop up at some time or another. So we might as well try at our own pace, of course, to work with those emotions so that we don't end up in that situation where we have, like a debilitating breakdown because we've suppressed so much of our emotions.
Uh-huh. And it seems like another factor that plays into this is that we live in a culture that is moving so quickly. I remember when I was working full time, like a lot of people get, I think, maybe 1 day off and then maybe 3 days off if it's a family member. And I just remember being so shocked by that. It's like, that's not enough time. And it seems like because we're moving so quickly, we also don't get the proper time to grieve unless we take it intentionally. And so a lot of people are being asked to keep going or go right back to work, and which in some ways can be good because you're surrounded by community, or at least some community. What would you say about that piece?
Yeah, I always thought that 1 to 3 days of bereavement time was always crazy. When I was in the corporate world too, I think there are cultures around the world that have different rituals around this where they'll take 8 days or a full couple weeks and really just care for the grieving people. And I love that approach. It's so much more community centric and so much more supportive. So, yeah, I do think 1 to 3 days of bereavement is not a lot of time. But in some ways too, like it depends on the way the person has died and the type of loss. Because again, that idea of titration, it's like at the very beginning of a loss, sometimes we're not really emotionally equipped to deal with our grief anyways. So some people cope with their grief by overworking. So I'm not saying that's like the healthiest approach, and I'm not saying that's the way to go, but in some ways having 3 days off, it's definitely not a good thing, but in some ways a lot of the time people aren't ready to feel their grief at that stage anyways. So
Mm-hmm.
what might be a better approach is like, okay, sure, just a few days off to attend the funeral when it first happens. But then if we were to allow that person, let's say like a month off whenever they needed it, whether that's 3 months down the line or whether that's 6 months down the line or a year down the line, to carve out proper time to feel their grief, that might be a more supportive approach. But
Uh-huh.
everyone's different, right? Like everyone grieves differently and everybody feels their grief at different times. Like that would have to be up to the individual to say to their workplace, like whether it's 6 months later after they've lost someone, hey, like I'm starting to really feel my grief come up and I'm wanting to work with it. Can I take the summer off to go visit my loved ones or to just go be out in nature or whatever that may be. But that in an ideal world, like that would be how I would suggest that we handle grief, is like to take time off when we're ready to feel it and when we're ready to intentionally work with it. But at the same time, like, yeah, with titration, most of us don't feel all of our grief all at once. Building in practices where we can start to feel that, but then developing the capacity to be able to come out of that too and come up for air so that we're not always under those waves buried under the grief, but we're coming up from air, and it becomes kind of a cycle of like, even me today, even 25 years into my grief, I still get grief that comes up, but I feel it in waves and a little bit at a time, and then I'll come out of that experience and go do something that does bring me joy and then go back into that grief when I'm ready.
Mm-hmm. And even even myself in this moment and through this conversation so far, I'm realizing that going to the Death Cafe and having the prompts and the conversation that we have was really like quite organic and light and flowing. And I've got this energy in this conversation of like treading lightly and noticing emotions coming up. And to me, that's just a reflection of this topic holds so much energy that is wanting to move and wanting to be expressed. And yet, even in my own experience, it's like, I've got a lot to learn and I've got a lot to experience. And so it's just really interesting to notice all of that in me, which like I said, it's a reflection of the importance of this topic, but also our avoidance of the topic.
Yeah. And that's why I always emphasize so strongly at those death cafes that, to take care of yourself for the days afterwards. Because even if you didn't feel sorrow come up in the circle last night, it's like talking about those kinds of topics can elicit grief and it can kind of catch you off guard, right? So,
Yeah.
something that we talked about last night at the circle, you like 2 days from now, you might be like, oh, yeah, like that brought up something for you
Hmm.
that reminded you of a loss you had. And then you might start to feel that emotion. So, that's why I always emphasize so strongly, like, just take care of yourself for the next few days after those circles because grief can be a little bit unpredictable and catch us off guard. And we just want to be prepared for when that does come up to welcome that emotion and that sadness and to make space to feel it. So whether that means going out and for a walk in nature to move that through you, going for a Reiki session to move that through you, like whatever your practice is, it's just important for us to welcome that feeling in instead of suppressing it. And that's also why I say in the deck cafe is if tears start to flow when we're in conversation, let them. Don't try to suppress them. And also, it's a safe space being in community like that to feel held in that. So it's not like you need to, like, if you start crying, you need to leave the room and experience that. You're completely welcome to stay in the circle and let the tears flow and just let that emotion move through you while you're in community with us. And that's just part of it, right? In our culture, our grief does tend to be really buried within our bodies because we're not a culture that openly expresses our grief a lot of the time.
Hmm.
So that's why it can crop up unexpectedly because usually for a lot of us, it's kind of buried in different kind of pockets of our body and it'll get triggered by talking about something else or a different loss or different emotion and it'll bring it up.
Totally. And when you think of the work that you're doing, where do you hope to see things changing like 5 years from now as you do this work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I envision community death care becoming a bigger part of our society again. So, yeah, I have this intention of having kind of a space where people can come feel held at the end of life and their family members can come. There's actually a space that exists like this already in Victoria. It's called Maid House. There's one in Toronto too. The first location started in Toronto, and then they recently opened one in Victoria. And it's for people that are opting for medical assistance in dying. So they've already gone through the process, they've been assessed by physicians, all of that. And let's say they don't want to die at home because their spouse might not want the memory of them passing away in their bed, for example. It's a space that people can go to have their final moments with their family members, and there can be ritual infused into that experience. And yeah, it's just space that people can go to experience that. And then after that, the family can opt to have a home funeral if they'd like, or to use a funeral home. But it's just like a lot more intentional of a process. So, where do I see my work going in 5 years? One of my intentions is to potentially have a space where people can come experience the whole spectrum of feelings, I guess, that come up with death and grief, but also potentially having a space where people can actually come to spend their last moments with family members and where I can help lead them through ritual and ceremony that is supportive to the moment that their person passes and also support them through the grieving process. So that's kind of my own individual kind of vision for the next 5 years. And then generally speaking, for this field of death work, I'm envisioning more community death care. Like the first step of that is community death cafes, just to familiarize people with talking about death and bringing that topic out of the shadows and destigmatizing death. as a topic. And that's kind of step one. And then, yeah, home funerals would kind of be another step to that. And then our society becoming more comfortable feeling our grief. So just a lot less suppression and a lot more openness around people grieving around us and us knowing how to support that and having the capacity to support each other. Because yeah, we can't grieve alone. Grieving is better done in community where we can feel supported. And as a society, kind of need to learn how to hold each other in that. And by always avoiding talking about death, we're kind of preventing that grief tending from being able to happen amongst each other because all of us are too scared to cry or to feel anything. It doesn't really allow for the rest of the process to happen. But the first step is getting more comfortable with the topic of death and feeling our emotions in the first place so that we can support each other in them.
Mm. You're reminding me of something that a wise friend of mine often would speak, and it's the phrase, "You don't get extra points for doing it alone." And it really seems to fit here because going through loss with others and being supported in that process, it must have a huge impact. And then I think about how that circles back to the death cafes, giving that experience of being in community and having the conversation and being nurtured and it being a safe space is really the beginnings of that shift. If you could speak to someone who's listening to this podcast and is trying to go at it alone, what might you suggest to them or offer to them to step into something that is supportive and there is community like a death cafe? But what would you say to them to help them make that step?
Like someone that has experienced a fresh loss or just somebody that is scared of talking about death.
Someone who's scared to talk about death for whatever reason that might be, whether they've lost or they're scared to lose, or it's something that they want to talk about but don't know how to talk about.
So, what I would say from my experience in this field so far is that so many people are avoidant of talking about it, but then once they do talk about it, they feel this sense of like relief and openness, and they just feel freer because it's kind of like this big thing that we build up in our minds of like, oh, death, like with anything taboo, not just death, but with anything that's taboo. The more we avoid it, the more of kind of like this elusive, big, scary thing it seems like, right? But then once we start to unpack it, that's when we realize it's not actually as scary as it seems. With my work, there's this process called advanced care planning. And it's basically when you think about what you want the end of your life to look like and then you document that and then you talk about that with your loved ones. And a lot of the times what I find with clients is they might be a little bit apprehensive to go through that process in the beginning, but once they've gone through that process with me and they have all of their end of life wishes figured out and documented, they feel much more free to go out and live their lives because they've kind of taken care of that and delved into that and realized that it actually wasn't as scary as they thought it would be. And then they feel like they've gotten that out of the way and they can go live their best life basically. So a lot of the times people are apprehensive to talk about death because sometimes people think like, oh, if I talk about death, it's gonna make it happen sooner, or like all these weird notions we have with that process in particular. A lot of people find it actually really life affirming because in that process too, they realize how much choice they have in the matter. And people don't realize that you can have a home funeral, for example, or people don't realize that you can like make your wishes known. So whether you want to die alone, but other people want to die surrounded by people, the process of thinking about what you might want your end of life to look like can be very customized. And we're lucky in the society that we live in that, it's kind of a luxury to be able to think about that because we're not facing war or famine here in North America, but we live in a society where a lot of us live to older ages and we can think about what we might want in an ideal world, what we might want our death to look like. So some people might want like rock music and people drinking beer around them at their deathbed, and other people might want to be out in nature and, just have like harp music playing or just one candle lit and not as much talking. So, yeah, so for people that are scared to kind of think about death or talk about death, what I would say to them is that you might surprise yourself in how good it actually feels to unpack that topic. And you might realize that there's not as much to fear as you might think. And yeah, by going through that process or just by starting to talk about death, you might learn a lot and realize that it's not that scary. Maybe
Mm.
I'll throw the question back at you too, because the death cafes, the point of those is to kind of start unpacking that, right? So
Hmm.
when you've come to the last couple death cafes, how have you felt when you've left? Has it been a little bit daunting and scary to come in and talk about death, but then what have you realized in coming to them?
I think that's why I asked the question, or was trying to stumble through asking a question, is because I was hoping that someone would hear what they needed to hear to be able to go, and then you throwing the question back at me is perfect. So yeah, I'm really so happy that I've gone to the last two, and I left feeling lifted and I felt energized. I really appreciated the level of conversation and dialogue and the different directions that the topics went. In these two experiences for me, it was very supportive. And I just love the connection that formed between everybody there by talking about a challenging topic. But we ended up talking about things that were just really organic based on the prompts that you provide. So it was really great. I love it.
Yeah, and and to go back to your earlier point about me not calling them death cafes, that's actually very intentional on my part. So, what I've found since I've been involved in this work is that people are very afraid and avoidant of the word death.
Yeah.
It's called my death cafes soul talks, living well, dying well. And yeah, they're done in death cafe format, but that's the title I give them because if I just put up posters out in the community that said death cafe, I feel like less people would come. And same with my title. So I belong to an association called the End of Life Doula Association of Canada. When I started this work, I used to call myself an end of life doula because it's
Mm,
softer. But I've since transitioned into calling myself a death doula because I think that my role as a death doula, part of my responsibility is to destigmatize death. So I've
mm,
now started to call myself a death doula because that is what I am and that is the topic at hand. So I'm trying to do my part in destigmatizing that by calling myself a death doula instead of always softening it down to end of life doula. So maybe someday instead of calling my death cafes soul talks, maybe I will transition to calling
mm.
them death cafes. But yeah, a little bit more about death cafes too. It's actually a global movement. So I didn't come up with the idea of a death cafe. It's a global movement. They're done all over the world with the intention of destigmatizing the topic of death. So yeah, I didn't invent them. I just have my version of them that I run
Hmm.
here in Nanaimo.
And I remember when I was in Squamish, there was a death cafe offered, and I didn't go, even though I was curious. That's what it was called, and I just didn't understand what it was about. So I appreciate that you're describing them in a way that it feels more accessible. I also appreciate that you're wanting to destigmatize the very topic that there's so much resistance to. So, all right, we have to unfortunately wrap up the conversation, but I always like to close with the question, what's one simple way someone could connect with the sacred today? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I love this question. I would encourage folks to set up an altar space if they can. So I think of altars as a way for us here on earth to be able to call in spirit. It's the intention that we're bringing to that space, whether it's just like lighting a candle or maybe we have crystals around it or photographs or meaningful objects. But I think of an altar as kind of a signpost from down here on earth where we're kind of trying to call in spirit to come commune with us. And it can be really simple. Like for me, I have a few altar spaces. I have one in my Reiki studio where I have kind of all my shamanic tools that I use with clients and oracle decks. And then I have my own personal altar out in my living room above my fireplace where I have photographs of my ancestors that have passed and that stuff. So it's a bit more personal to me. But even something as simple as just a candle with the intention of lighting it and calling in spirit can act as an altar. Or we had someone at the Death Cafe last night say that she calls in her grandmother's spirit by having a teacup on her altar and pouring her grandmother orange pekoe tea every morning, inviting her to walk with her that day, which is really beautiful. I think it's about the intention behind it. So not necessarily what the space looks like, but the intention with which we keep that space. So if we have flowers on it, just changing out the flowers so that our ancestors always have fresh flowers there, keeping it clean and dust free. So yeah, so how can people call in the sacred? I would say one of the easiest ways is to just create a little altar space in your home or even outside. Just make that an intentional space where you're calling in your ancestors.
Hmm. Thank you for that. I love that. And I actually did light a candle this morning for my ancestors because of the inspiration that came from last night.
I also have a candle that I lit before we got on this call.
Nice. And so, Maïa, if anybody wants to stay connected with you, where might be the best place for them to find you?
Probably the website betweenrealms.ca. Yeah, that's the easiest way to connect. I do have an Instagram page, which is just at Between Realms Death Care. And I also have a Facebook page, but probably the website is the easiest.
Excellent. And we'll make sure that all those links are in the show notes.
Perfect. Awesome.
So really grateful to have had this conversation with you, Maïa. I also appreciate that I had this experience of being a little bit knocked off center, which is, I think, nothing but a good thing given the topic. But I appreciate the level of knowledge that you bring to this topic, the level of passion, and the way that you navigate it with ease and create sort of this simple way of looking at it, even though it's a very complex topic. So I appreciate your guidance and your wisdom. And it was great to have this conversation with you.
Aw, thanks, Ross. Thanks a lot for having me.
And to everyone listening, thank you for tuning in. Until next time, take good care. Thank you for joining us here on Sacred Sundays. I hope something in today's offering spoke to your spirit, stirred something true, or simply gave you a moment to breathe. You can find more Sacred Sundays episodes, as well as other conversations from the Sacred Village podcast at sacredvillagepodcast.com. Feel free to share this episode with someone who might need it. Until next time, may your Sunday be slow and sacred. Bye for now.